Oh look! A video by Bill Maher appeared on my recommended tab. I wonder what it's about.
Gay trans dick saw, just a phase.
Oh, it's that kind of video, eh? Now, there's a lot to be said about this video. Like how Bill acts bewildered at the idea that the queer community would be disproportionately affected by the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Really? Abortion rights affects gay and trans people more than, breeders?
Even though you can just look this up and see that there are studies on abortion showing that bisexual women are more likely to have had an abortion, and that it's not uncommon for lesbians to have abortions either. Or how Bill fetishizes the idea of facts and studies, as right-wingers often do, only to not actually cite any studies and instead just gesture vaguely at some imagined parents made of straw who are just so eager to chop off their son's dick to get likes on social media. And maybe I or someone else will decide to debunk this video point by point in the future, but for now I'd like to focus on what's really its central premise.
I'm just saying that when things change this much, this fast, people are allowed to ask, what's up with that?
You're right, Bill. It is okay to ask questions and try to understand why younger generations are more likely to identify as queer. But that's not really what he's doing, is it? No, Bill doesn't go on to explore this topic in an honest manner. He just fearmongers about trans kids for 9 minutes. So instead, I've decided to do what he didn't and try to answer the question, why are kids these days so gay? First, let's look at how many people identify as LGBT in each generation. The estimates Bill points to are from a 2021 poll by Gallup, and he's right. The percentage of people who identify as LGBTQ roughly doubles from one generation to the next. But if we scroll down a bit, we can see that most of them don't identify as trans, like Bill's fearmongering and focus on trans kids would imply. Most of Gen Z who identify as LGBT describe themselves as bisexual, with only 2.1% saying they're trans. And while that is a higher percentage than previous generations, it's only a minority of the 21% of Gen Z who are queer. A subsequent Gallup poll found a similar result, with 19.7% of Gen Z saying they're LGBTQ and 1.9% describing themselves as trans. There is also a survey conducted by the Williams Institute from 2017 to 2020, which found that 1.4% of teens aged 13 to 17 identified as trans. Taken together, these estimates suggest that somewhere between 1.4 to 2% of Gen Z likely identifies as trans, though there are some methodological caveats that suggest that the larger of these estimates may be correct. Included in the not trans category of the Williams survey are people who said they were unsure if they were trans or who refused to answer the question. It's not uncommon for trans people to go through a period of uncertainty or even denial when figuring out their identity. It's likely that at least some of the people who answered with don't know/not sure are trans and going through the motions of self-discovery. In the Gallup poll, some people also opted to skip the questions, with a non-response rate of 6.6% being reported for 2021 and 7% for 2022. At any rate, the point is that while there has been an increase in the number of people identifying as trans, they account for only a minority of Gen Z who are queer, with the main difference being that our generation is more likely to identify as bisexual. And why is that? Well, part of the reason is that as homophobia and heteronormativity become less common, younger people are more willing to disclose a non-heterosexual identity and same-sex attraction. Bill actually mentions this, but is quick to dismiss it as it's trendy.
Yes, part of the rise in LGBT numbers is from people feeling free enough to tell it to a pollster, and that's all to the good. But some of it is, it's trendy.
And sure, it's not impossible that there are at least some people who describe themselves as bi simply because it's trending in their social circles, or because they like anime fanboys even if they've never actually sucked dick. You can find at least one example of pretty much everything in the world, so it's basically guaranteed that you'll find at least one example of this. But Bill underestimates the extent to which more self-disclosure affects the results of the polls in the queer community. A survey from 2015 used the veiled response method called the list experiment or unmatched count to assess the extent to which direct reporting underestimated the prevalence of non-heterosexual identity and anti-gay sentiment. I'm going to put some text on screen explaining how unmatched count works in case you'd like to pause and read, but the gist of it is that this elicits more truthful responses from participants because it gives greater anonymity to their answers. The researchers found that indirect questioning led to a substantial increase in the number of participants reporting a non-heterosexual identity and same-sex sexual experience. When separating the results by age group, we see one of the reasons why younger people are more likely to report being queer. For respondents under 31, the number who reported a non-heterosexual identity or same-sex sexual experience didn't change much when using the veiled method, increasing by only 3.3 and 4.4% respectively. For participants between the ages of 31 and 50, the increase was much more pronounced, at 20.9% and 19.6% respectively. There are methodological caveats to keep in mind when reading this study, such as the sample not being representative of the US population, and the list experiment does yield fairly large error bars. Nonetheless, this does give us evidence that older generations feel less comfortable disclosing an LGBTQ identity, which is at least part of why Gen Z is much more likely to openly report being queer. We can also find more evidence of this in a study from 2021, which used another veiled response method called randomized response technique to estimate the prevalence of non-heterosexuality in Taiwan. Among 20 to 34-year-olds, 3.5% reported not being heterosexual when asked directly, while for those aged 35 and older, this was 1.2%. Using the RRT, the researchers estimated that
18%
of the younger group and
10.3%
of the older group was not heterosexual. If we assume that the results of the RRT represent the real prevalence of non-heterosexuality among these groups, this means that for younger respondents, about
80.6%
of LGBT participants didn't say they were non-heterosexual, while for the older group, this was
88.4%.
This suggests not only that many queer people aren't willing to disclose their identity, at least in Taiwan, but also that older LGBT people were slightly more likely to hide their sexuality when asked directly, showing once again that older folks are just less likely to admit to being queer. Of course, this is not the only reason why younger generations are more likely to be queer. There's also the fact that sexuality is influenced by the environment in a variety of ways. Now, I just want to make it clear that when I say this, I don't mean that sexuality is a choice. Sexuality is kind of like a personality trait, in that it is influenced by both genetic and environmental factors, and can even be malleable for some people, but that doesn't make it a choice any more than being an extrovert or an introvert is. All of this is to say that kids these days might be more gay because the environment they grew up in is different from previous generations. As homophobia and heteronormativity become less prominent, not only are more people willing to openly admit that they're gay, but more people are willing to try a little gay. This is anecdotal, but I think it illustrates this point well. There's a famous Reddit story from a guy who thought he was being homophobic towards his gay roommate, because he got mad whenever he saw his roommate with other guys. Fast forward a couple of days, and after discussing this with several Redditors and his sister, he finds out that what he's feeling isn't homophobia, but jealousy. Eventually him and his roommate talk it out, and they end up in a relationship. Had this happened a couple decades earlier, the story would have likely gone very differently. For starters, the gay roommate probably wouldn't have been out about being gay, and might have been acting in a more stereotypically straight manner to not raise suspicion. Had the straight guy found out that his roommate was gay, there would be a higher chance that he was homophobic, and even if he wasn't, he'd be far less likely to question his own sexuality after thinking of himself as straight for most of his life. Their story only ended the way it did because they live in a time where homophobia is less prevalent in society. We can see more evidence of this in a 2019 YouGov poll which asks several questions about sexuality. In the full results we find that compared to older generations, younger people were more likely to say that sexuality is a scale rather than a binary, and younger heterosexual respondents were also more willing to entertain the possibility of being attracted to the same sex. And while I've been mostly focusing on LGBT people, all of what I just talked about also applies to trans people. More trans people are willing to disclose the fact that they're trans on polls, and as transphobia and cisnormativity become less common, more young people are willing to question their gender identity and describe themselves as trans. It wasn't that long ago when people thought that to be trans you needed to have the surgery, but society's understanding of what it means to be trans has changed, and now more people believe that being trans is more about self-identity and what expectations society has of different genders. We can see some evidence of this in the 2015 US Transgender Survey, as younger respondents were significantly more likely to identify as non-binary. The reality is that while Bill and other TERFs fearmonger about thick saws, more kids identify as queer exactly because most people don't buy into his fearmongering. As Bill's homophobia and transphobia become more outdated and unpopular ideas, acceptance of the LGBTQ community increases, and so will the number of people who identify as queer. There is one more thing that we need to consider when answering the question of why younger people are more likely to be queer, which is the fact that queer people are just less likely to grow older. And I don't mean that we're all magic vampires who don't age, although I wish we were.
So suck your dick!
I mean that we're just more likely to die, and on average we die younger than cishet people. This is due to a variety of factors. Queer people are more likely to be poor, and by result are less likely to be able to afford healthcare. In large part due to unsupportive families, LGBTQ people are also more likely to be homeless and commit suicide. Plus, we're also more likely to be victims of violent crime, and especially of hate crimes. The reality is that while Bill and other TERFs fearmonger about dick saws under the guise of protecting children, their lies will lead to more children dying. Some parents who watch Bill's show have queer children who may not be out. When they do come out, these parents might believe that their child is just going through a phase, or that they've been groomed into joining the LGBT cult. Some of these kids may be kicked out, or may choose to run away from home because of their unsupportive families. Some of them will go on to take their own lives, either at a young age, or later in life because the emotional scars they suffered never healed. While it's good that homophobia and transphobia are becoming more outdated and unpopular, Bill spreading these falsehoods for the sake of clicks and money has a real and measurable impact in the lives of queer people. This is what we mean when we say that pundits, politicians, and other public figures have blood on their hands. It's not that they personally killed anyone or even called for violence. It's that their rhetoric, their insistence on spreading lies and fears will go on to cause real harm, whether directly or not. If Bill and others like him really care about protecting the kids, perhaps, like said kids, it's time for him to change.